by Laura. Yes, by Laura Matthews, who teaches at Auburn University. And if she wants to introduce herself a little bit more, I'll let her do that herself at the beginning of her talk. But let me mention the title of her talk, which is a 4E approach to responsibility in mental disorder. So Laura, you have about 25 minutes and then there's time for questions.
Okay, great. From beginning. Okay, yes, so thank you. My name is Laura Matthews. I'm an instructor at Auburn University in Auburn, Alabama in the US. I do primarily philosophy of psychiatry and mostly from an enactive perspective. So my talk is a 4E approach to responsibility and mental disorder. 4E meaning embedded, extended, enactive, or embodied approaches to the mind. But in particular, I'm going to explore this issue from the perspective of the inactive approach, which I would argue kind of incorporates most of the other commitments from the other 4E approaches. So I'm going to move through the following topics here. First, I'm going to introduce the definition of cognition from the inactive perspective. I'll then go on to talk about specifically human functions of social sense making or intersubjective adaptivity. There's going to be some connections there to the concept of relational autonomy from the feminist literature. Then I'll talk about what mental disorder is from this inactive perspective. And from there, I can look at the ways in which moral responsibility might be hindered in mental disorder. Obviously, this is going to be different in different mental disorders. It's an extremely heterogeneous concept, but I would suggest that some general claims can still be made. And then finally, I'll explore ways of thinking about agency and the promotion of agency in mental disorder from this perspective, with the claim being essentially that agency is then built back up from this relational perspective, that the social structure has to be there in order to help subjects foster their autonomy capacities. Okay, so first, cognition on the inactive approach. It's essentially embodied sense making. So embodied sense making is going to be comprised of the skills of autopoiesis and adaptivity, where autopoiesis means essentially self-production, and adaptivity is a self-monitoring and self-regulating with the aim of bringing the organism closer to some ideal range of states which are endogenously determined. So from the inactive perspective, cognitive systems are always autopoietic systems. They're self-producing, they're autonomous in this particular sense, which means that they determine their bodily selves through their own activity. They're going to determine their own interactions with the environment. And they determine through these autopoietic processes a set of norms relative to their own survival, which guide the system's interaction with the environment. So, for example, if we take a kind of minimal biological form, like a little bacterium floating around trying to find a source of food, what the inactive approach says is that it's the activity of the bacterium's autopoietic processes which allow it to differentiate between, for example, sources of food, which will be seen as good from the perspective of the bacterium, from things in its environment that are not food, which are going to be seen mostly as neutral from the perspective of the bacterium. Further, from things in the environment that might be threatening to it, which are going to be seen as bad from this perspective. So embodied and self-producing organisms are going to generate norms which condition the way that the world appears to them. In addition to this, the organism is going to adaptively respond to the environment in order to sustain or even augment its capacities to maintain itself. So for example, the bacterium, when it's swimming around its environment, it's going to adaptively seek out not just any source of food, but the best source of food. This could be the source of food that contains the densest energy supply. It could be the most nutritionally useful food. In either case, it's the capacity for adaptivity that allows the bacterium to differentiate between better and worse sources of food, and therefore to differentiate between better and worse courses of action. So this is adaptive behavior. And adaptive behavior requires two different capacities: self-monitoring and self-regulating. Where self-monitoring is the process of registering the current state of the system through whatever mechanisms are dedicated to that. And self-regulating involves moving the system from its current state to a more optimal state, where that more optimal state is determined through the activity of the organism itself. So there's this ideal range of states that the organism is constantly trying to adaptively move towards. And that ideal range of states is going to depend on their needs as a living being. And they're sort of just constantly always regulating themselves towards that. So inactivists are going to highlight what I would call the mind-life continuum, which is to say that living organisms are all sense-making or cognitive systems. They might not all be conscious, but they are all cognitive in the sense that they're autopoietic and adaptive. And autopoiesis and adaptivity are the conditions for norm-guided cognition and behavior. But there are obviously going to be drastic and important developments beyond this more minimal form of cognition for more complex sense makers like human beings. And one of the most important developments in this regard is that human beings have to make sense not just of the physical environment, not just the kind of simplistic environment of the bacterium, but an extremely complex social and cultural environment. So adaptive behavior for human beings is going to always require adaptively navigating this intersubjective context. And this involves adaptively navigating what I call the social situation, where the social situation refers to the loose collection of values, institutions, norms, and relationships that are going to together inform, enable, or constrain one's sense making. So your social situation is going to involve things like your relationships to family and friends, the kinds of values that would be enacted in a family group, as well as the values and norms of the sort of wider sociocultural group, and the institutions that comprise the society in which one lives. So just as an organism's environment can be more or less hospitable for adaptive behavior, so too can a human being's social situation be more or less hospitable. So your social situation could enable autonomous and adaptive sense making, which makes it possible for individuals to pursue their own sense of well-being as they understand it. Or your social situation could be overly restrictive, could frustrate your pursuit of your own well-being in various kinds of ways. So there's kind of these two things that are necessary for adaptive behavior. There's the kind of social environment that you need that is sufficiently hospitable, but you also need these capacities for intersubjective adaptivity. So this is referring to self-monitoring and self-regulating that allow an individual to adaptively navigate their social situation to pursue this ideal range of states. But these ideal range of states for human beings are going to be more personal level states like your social roles, your relationships, your hobbies, your work, your goals. In general, you could call this your socially embedded identity. So whereas the bacterium is trying to regulate and maintain just these minimal bodily states, human beings are doing that, but also regulating and maintaining socially embedded identity states. In either case, this ideal range is one that is self-determined. So it's not something that's imposed on the organism from without. It's something that she's going to determine for herself. This is through both conscious and subconscious mechanisms, whereby she's deciding on which relationships, which hobbies, activities, etc., she wants to maintain or cultivate, and which ones she wants to leave behind. So obviously the cognition that's involved here is much more complex than in the minimal organism, but it's still based on the capacities for self-monitoring and self-regulating that are going to serve as the basis for all adaptive behavior. Okay, so there are some important similarities between this concept of intersubjective adaptivity and relational approaches to autonomy that come from the feminist literature. So relational autonomy is a feminist response to traditional approaches to autonomy, which are going to emphasize substantive independence. So on traditional views, the self is seen as individualistic, and autonomy is conceived of as a capacity for sort of determining one's own life plan independently of the influence of other people. And the feminist response to this is to emphasize the relational nature of the self. So what this means is that feminists are going to argue that relationality is prior to individuality. We're born into the world as dependent on our caregivers, and it's only through this kind of empathic relationship to our caregivers, to the social environment more generally, for example, the education that we're provided, only through these relational features that we can come to make decisions for ourselves and to develop into self-determining people. So, of course, there are going to be several competing approaches to relational autonomy in the feminist literature, but the central claim running throughout these theories is that the capacity for self-determination is going to require both of these things. First of all, certain kinds of relationships and a certain kind of social situation, which fosters the individual's capacities, as well as the actual capacities which the individual cultivates herself, sort of located more in the individual. So intersubjective adaptivity should be understood in this similar kind of light as requiring both a conducive social environment as well as the individual capacities of self-monitoring and self-regulating. All of this with the aim of moving the subject towards her own self-determined ideal range of states. Okay, so from this perspective, mental disorder can be understood as a kind of inadaptivity. So it's not going to be a brain disorder, but rather a disorder of adaptive behavior in a social context. And it's going to involve primarily a failure of self-monitoring and self-regulating that results in the individual being incapable to varying degrees of achieving her own self-determined goals and of maintaining her in her self-determined ideal range of states. So the idea being that under healthy circumstances, the adaptive person is always kind of working towards this ideal range of states. In mental disorder, the subject ends up working away from these states. And again, these are personal level states involving things like developing along a particular career track or cultivating meaningful relationships, engaging in hobbies, etc. So all of the adaptive processes are generally sort of moving the subject towards things that make life successful, meaningful, pleasant, as the subject herself understands these things. And in mental disorder, she's kind of moving in the opposite direction. So mental disorder on this view is not located entirely within the brain. Altered neural mechanisms may contribute to the disorder, but the disorder is going to be seen from a larger perspective as something that emerges from the relations between the brain, the body, and the environment, and that's including the social environment. So the disorder must always be conceived of as relative to the social environment, in the sense that the disorder consists of the subject's incapacity to regulate herself in relation to that social environment. So this is a way of sort of incorporating adaptivity to social norms in ways that are not necessarily necessary in specifically neurological disorders, where the neurological disorder could be localized to dysfunction in brain activity, whereas in the mental disorder, it's going to be a kind of relational sort of process. So sort of a couple consequences of conceiving of mental disorder in this way. So this is sort of a brief sketch of what the inactive approach would say about mental disorder. And here are a couple consequences. It's going to avoid these two, what I would suggest are problematic consequences of the brain disease model of mental disorder. The first being that the brain disease model appears to contribute to stigma in certain ways rather than decreasing it. So for example, Reed et al. Showed that when people view mental illness as an illness like any other, and attribute the illness to biogenetic causes, that this leads to increases in fear and prejudice against people with mental disorder rather than decreases. So instead of reducing stigma, the conception that mental disorder is a brain or genetic disorder can sometimes lead to perceptions of unpredictability, of dangerousness, and so forth. And then I would suggest that there's a kind of connection here between the idea that the patient is the subject of a brain disease and the idea that the patient is not in control of their behavior, has no agency with respect to her disorder. And this is the kind of second problem, potential problem with the brain disease model of mental disorder, which is that it has the capacity to diminish a patient's sense of agency over her disorder. So the idea that my symptoms could be the result of some kind of chemical imbalance in the brain, which is sort of what we hear a lot in the popular lexicon, this can contribute to a sense of quietism, in the sense that I have no control over the chemical reactions in my brain. These are not the kinds of things that are in my voluntary control. So when people think of their problems as being entirely caused by chemical reactions in their brain, there's no reason to think that there's anything within their power to change those symptoms, except, of course, maybe taking psychopharmaceuticals or something like this. So when we instead expand our conception of what the disorder involves, think of it instead as a disorder of adaptive behavior, we can see that there are many different components of the disorder that can interact to create the subject's problems or symptoms. So of course, yes, there could be altered neural mechanisms, and perhaps maybe there often are, or maybe always are, but it's difficult to know whether those altered mechanisms are the cause of symptoms or the result of disordered processes. My view would suggest that there's a kind of interaction between the two, maybe a sort of feedback loop. But we can also look at what else is involved in the kind of causal connections that we're looking at here. Other aspects contributing to the disorder, so things like problematic relationships, a history of trauma, avoidance behaviors that are strengthening rather than weakening symptoms, rumination, stress, any number of things. What contributes to the disorder is obviously going to differ depending on what the disorder is. But in any case, there are going to be some aspects of the disorder that are within the subject's control. And emphasizing those things that are within their control is, I would suggest, the first step to promoting agency and helping the subject to work her way back to a place where she can autonomously pursue her life goals. So how then to conceive of moral agency in mental disorder? Inadaptivity hinders moral agency to the extent that it hinders autonomy. So oftentimes we see the question of moral culpability cast in these metaphysical terms about the question as to whether or not the subject could have acted otherwise, for example, or even more broadly, questions about whether any action is freely determined or if they're all equally unfree. But I would suggest that it's more productive to cast these questions in terms of autonomy. So we can ask, was the choice autonomously generated in the sense that the subject was aware of what she was doing, intended to do it, understood the consequences of her actions, etc. So we know that inadaptivity is, in a sense, a blow to autonomous decision-making, but autonomy is not going to be entirely destroyed in mental disorder. People who suffer from mental disorder might have less control over their behavior and perhaps have less control during certain kinds of episodes of heightened symptoms, but they don't have no control. So there are two ways of thinking about this. We could ask, do people who suffer from mental disorders have agency? Or we could ask, are people who have mental disorders morally responsible for their actions? These are going to be separate yet related questions. I think in response to the first question about whether there's agency, we have to answer in the affirmative. It's true that mental disorders might negatively impact a person's capacity to make autonomous decisions, and so they might have diminished agency. But this is much different from saying that they have no agency. And agency is often going to wax and wane over the course of a disorder. Perhaps during more severe episodes, agency will be at lower levels. Patients might need to try to take advantage of those times when their symptoms subside so that they can try to be more proactive in taking steps to mitigate further episodes. And I think this kind of leads into an answer to the second question. People can have agency, generally speaking, and yet still not be morally culpable for certain behaviors, because they might arise, for example, out of extreme episodes that are intermittent. So I think we can imagine extreme cases where a person might still have agency from this longer term perspective and yet still not be morally culpable for certain actions. But I think more likely in cases of mental disorder, the moral responsibility is going to lie sort of between the two extremes of completely responsible and completely not responsible. Okay, so then treatment should be kind of seen as a way of building back this autonomy, this agency, this responsibility. And this is achieved through the same kinds of relationships, the same kinds of supportive environments that allow us to develop autonomy in the first place. Albeit with respect to mental disorder, this is going to be more specialized in the sense that it's going to involve people who are trained specifically to help people with the kinds of problems that they are facing. But I think we can still think of the therapeutic setting as a place where relational autonomy is built back up. This can involve things like providing patients with the tools that they need to navigate their symptoms effectively, so that they can kind of, once again, pursue that sense of well-being that they determine for themselves. It can also happen by reworking workplaces in ways that allow people to adaptively navigate their symptoms, so that they can maintain autonomy and responsibility. And some of the ways that this can happen have been discussed by Rached in his 2019 article, just kind of giving people some alternative options for how they complete their work, essentially. So these are the articles that I referenced, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Laura. Perfect. Perfectly in time. And interesting. Of course, that's not the only.
Thank you.